December 1950. The Yellow Sea churns under a bitter wind. 30 kilometers up the Taedong River, the port city of Chinampo is about to fall. Thousands of United Nations troops and desperate Korean civilians crowd the docks, waiting for ships that may never come. The waterway ahead is choked with North Korean mines, invisible killers lurking beneath the dark surface. Any vessel that attempts this passage risks being torn apart. And yet, cutting through the freezing mist, 3 Canadian destroyers appear on the horizon, ships that many believed had already served their purpose, ships that should have been decommissioned years ago, ghost ships from a war that ended 5 years earlier. Now, they are the only hope for the trapped souls of Chinampo. If you find this story compelling, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and let me know in the comments where you are watching from today. To understand why Canada would send aging warships into one of the most dangerous naval operations of the Korean War, we must travel back to the summer of 1950. On June 25th, the Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel, pouring into South Korea with overwhelming force. 38,000 troops, supported by 150 Soviet-built T-34 tanks, swept southward. The Republic of Korea Army, caught off guard with a third of its personnel on leave, crumbled within days. Seoul fell. The United Nations scrambled to respond. And in Ottawa, Canadian military leaders faced a difficult decision. Canada's Royal Canadian Navy was a shadow of its wartime self. During the Second World War, the RCN had grown into the 4th largest navy in the world, with over 400 vessels patrolling the Atlantic, hunting German U-boats, and escorting convoys across the treacherous North Atlantic. But when the guns fell silent in 1945, the Navy shrank rapidly. Ships were decommissioned. Sailors returned to civilian life. By 1950, Canada possessed only a handful of operational destroyers. These were not modern vessels. They were Tribal-class and Crescent-class destroyers, designed and built during the Second World War. They had fought in the Atlantic and the English Channel. They had survived torpedo attacks and aerial bombardments. Now, rusting in Canadian ports, they seemed destined for the scrapyard. But the Korean War changed everything. When the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 82, calling for member states to provide military assistance to South Korea, Canada responded with remarkable speed. Less than 2 weeks after the invasion began, Ottawa announced it would send 3 destroyers to Korean waters. HMCS Cayuga, HMCS Athabascan, and HMCS Sioux steamed out of Esquimalt, British Columbia, carrying crews who had never seen combat. Many of these sailors were young men, trained during peacetime, unfamiliar with the terror of actual warfare. Their ships, however, carried the scars of a different era. The metal hulls had been patched and reinforced. The gun turrets had been fired in anger against Nazi Germany. The engines had churned through North Atlantic storms, while depth charges exploded around them. These vessels were veterans, even if their crews were not. The journey to Korea took weeks. The destroyers crossed the Pacific, stopping at Pearl Harbor and then pushing westward toward the Korean peninsula. The sailors had time to contemplate what awaited them. Intelligence reports painted a grim picture. The North Korean advance had been swift and brutal. American and South Korean forces were pinned inside the Pusan perimeter, a small defensive pocket in the southeastern corner of the peninsula. If that perimeter collapsed, the entire war would be lost. The Canadian destroyers arrived in Korean waters in late July 1950, joining a multinational naval force that included American, British, Australian, and New Zealand ships. Their mission was straightforward on paper, but brutal in execution. Shore bombardments, coastal patrols, interdiction of enemy supply lines, support for commando operations, and, when necessary, the evacuation of retreating United Nations troops. The first months were chaotic. The Canadians quickly learned that this war would be nothing like the stories their fathers told about convoy duty in the Atlantic. Korea's coastline was treacherous, rocky shores, narrow channels, unpredictable tides, and everywhere, mines. The North Koreans had seeded their coastal waters with thousands of contact and magnetic mines, turning every patrol into a game of deadly chance. The Canadian crews developed a morbid ritual. Before entering suspected mined waters, they would gather on deck, scanning the surface for any telltale sign of danger. A floating canister, an unusual ripple, the faint glint of a mooring cable. One wrong turn, one moment of inattention, and the ship could be torn in half. But the destroyers pressed on. HMCS Cayuga, under the command of Captain Jeffrey Brock, quickly earned a reputation for aggressive action. Brock was a veteran of the Second World War, a man who had learned to fight in the dark days when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. He pushed his crew hard, driving the aging destroyer into situations that would have made more cautious commanders blanch. Night raids along the North Korean coast, close-range bombardments of enemy positions, insertions of South Korean commandos behind enemy lines. The Cayuga became a symbol of Canadian determination, a ghost from a previous war that refused to stay buried. The other Canadian destroyers followed suit. HMCS Athabaskan and HMCS Sioux patrolled the eastern and western coasts of the Korean Peninsula, engaging enemy shore batteries, destroying coastal infrastructure, and providing fire support for ground troops. The work was relentless. Days blurred into weeks. The crews grew exhausted, their nerves frayed by constant danger. Sleep became a luxury. Hot meals were rare. The winter of 1950 brought freezing temperatures that turned the ships into floating ice boxes. Sailors wrapped themselves in every piece of clothing they could find, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Ice accumulated on the decks and rigging, requiring constant chipping to prevent the ships from becoming dangerously top-heavy. And then came Chinampo. In late November 1950, the war took a catastrophic turn. Chinese forces, which had been secretly massing north of the Yalu River, launched a massive offensive. Over 300,000 Chinese soldiers poured across the border, smashing into unprepared United Nations lines. The front collapsed. American, British, and South Korean units that had advanced almost to the Chinese border were suddenly fighting for their lives, retreating southward through frozen mountain passes. The port city of Chinampo, located on the western coast of North Korea, became a critical evacuation point. Thousands of UN troops and Korean civilians flooded into the city, desperate to escape before the Chinese arrived. But Chinampo presented a unique problem. The city sat more than 30 kilometers up the Taedong River, accessible only through a narrow, winding waterway that the North Koreans had heavily mined. Larger ships could not navigate the shallow channel. The mines made any approach suicidal, yet without naval support, the evacuation would fail. The people of Chinampo would be trapped, left to face the advancing enemy alone. The call went out for volunteers, ships willing to risk the mined river to save the trapped evacuees. 3 Canadian destroyers answered. HMCS Cayuga, HMCS Athabaskan, and HMCS Sioux would lead the way. The operation began on December 5, 1950. The destroyers entered the mouth of the Taedong River under cover of darkness, their crews at battle stations, eyes straining into the black water ahead. The channel was impossibly narrow. In some places the ships had to navigate single file, the muddy riverbanks close enough to touch. Minesweepers had done what they could to clear a path, but everyone knew that mines could have been missed. The slightest deviation from the swept channel could spell disaster. Captain Brock stood on the bridge of HMCS Cayuga, watching the dark water ahead. Behind him, the other Canadian destroyers followed in line, their wakes churning the river into foam. The tension was unbearable. Every sailor aboard knew the statistics. Contact mines required only a few pounds of pressure to detonate. Magnetic mines could sense a ship's hull from meters away. One mistake, and the river would become a grave. The Cayuga crept forward, her engines barely turning, her sonar operators listening for any sign of underwater danger. Occasionally, a lookout would shout an alarm, and the ship would slow to a crawl while the object ahead was identified. Drifting debris. A floating log. Once the bloated body of a North Korean soldier killed in the earlier fighting. Each time the crew held their breath, waiting to see if the next moment would bring an explosion. Each time the ship continued on, inch by inch, meter by meter, deeper into enemy territory. It took hours to navigate the river. By dawn, the Canadian destroyers had reached Chinampo, their guns trained on the surrounding hills, ready to provide covering fire for the evacuation. What they found shocked even the hardened veterans. The docks were packed with humanity, soldiers, many of them wounded, mixed with terrified Korean civilians. Women clutched children to their chests. Elderly men carried bundles of possessions, the remnants of their entire lives. The sound of distant gunfire echoed from the hills. The Chinese were close. The evacuation was a masterpiece of controlled chaos. Landing craft ferried soldiers and civilians to the waiting ships. The Canadian destroyers provided covering fire, their 4-inch guns booming as they targeted Chinese positions on the surrounding ridgelines. Throughout the day, the destroyers held the line, their aging hulls absorbing the stress of constant firing. By nightfall, thousands had been evacuated, but more remained, and the Chinese were drawing closer. The operation continued for 3 days. Each night, the destroyers withdrew down the river, navigating the mined channel in darkness, only to return at dawn to resume the evacuation. The strain on the crews was immense. Sleep deprivation took its toll. Sailors began to hallucinate, seeing mines where none existed, hearing explosions in the silence. Medical officers dispensed stimulants to keep the men alert, knowing that exhaustion could be as deadly as any enemy weapon. On December 8th, the final evacuees boarded the landing craft. The destroyers turned their guns on the port facilities, destroying anything that might be useful to the advancing Chinese. Warehouses went up in flames. Fuel depots exploded, sending columns of black smoke into the winter sky. And then, slowly, carefully, the Canadian destroyers began their final journey down the Taidong River. The withdrawal was the most dangerous part of the operation. The North Koreans had been reinforcing their positions along the riverbanks, and now they opened fire with everything they had. Machine guns rattled. Artillery shells splashed into the water around the ships. The destroyers returned fire, their guns barking defiance as they navigated the narrow channel. HMCS Cayuga took several hits from shore batteries, her hull pierced by shrapnel, but she kept moving. HMCS Athabascan's forward gun mount was damaged, forcing the crew to shift to secondary weapons. Still, the ships pressed on. By midnight on December 8th, the Canadian destroyers cleared the mouth of the Taidong River and reached open water. Behind them, Chinampo burned, the fires visible for miles. But the evacuation had succeeded. Thousands of lives had been saved. The ghost ships from the Second World War had proven their worth once again. The success at Chinampo cemented Canada's reputation among the United Nations naval forces. The aging destroyers, dismissed by some as relics of a bygone era, had accomplished what many believed impossible. They had navigated a mined river deep in enemy territory, held off Chinese forces, and extracted thousands of troops and civilians. The ghosts of the Second World War had returned, and they were still capable of fighting. If you are finding value in this deep dive into forgotten history, consider subscribing to support the channel and help bring more stories like this to life. But the Korean War was far from over, and the Canadian destroyers would continue to serve for years to come. Following the Chinampo evacuation, the RCN maintained a continuous presence in Korean waters. As the initial 3 destroyers rotated home for repairs and crew rest, they were replaced by additional ships. HMCS Nootka arrived in January 1951, followed by HMCS Iroquois, HMCS Huron, HMCS Haida, and HMCS Crusader. 8 Canadian warships would ultimately serve in Korea, a remarkable commitment for a nation with such a small peacetime navy. The duties of these ships evolved as the war progressed. The initial months had been characterized by rapid movement, as United Nations forces first retreated and then advanced up the peninsula. But by mid-1951, the front line stabilized near the 38th parallel, and the war settled into a grinding stalemate. For the Canadian destroyers, this meant a shift in focus. Shore bombardments remained important, but a new mission emerged that would define their contribution to the conflict: train hunting. The North Koreans relied heavily on railways to supply their frontline troops. The rugged terrain of the peninsula made road transport difficult, especially during the harsh winter months. Trains running along coastal tracks carried ammunition, food, fuel, and reinforcements to the communist forces. Destroy the trains and you could strangle the enemy's supply lines. The Canadian destroyers took to this mission with enthusiasm. Train hunting was a peculiar form of warfare, unlike anything the sailors had experienced before. The destroyers would patrol the coastline, their lookouts scanning the shore for any sign of movement. When a train was spotted, the ship would close to firing range and open up with everything it had. The goal was to hit the locomotive, bringing the entire train to a halt. Once the engine was disabled, the destroyers would methodically work their way down the length of the train, destroying each car in turn. The statistics were impressive. Of the 28 trains destroyed by United Nations naval forces during the Korean War, Canadian ships accounted for 8. HMCS Crusader alone was credited with 3 kills, her gunnery crews becoming experts at the delicate art of hitting a moving target from a rolling ship. But the numbers only tell part of the story. Each train destroyed meant hundreds of enemy soldiers who would not receive their supplies, artillery shells that would never reach the front, food that would never fill communist bellies. The Canadian destroyers were slowly bleeding the enemy dry. Of course, the enemy did not accept this passively. North Korean coastal batteries were positioned to protect the railway lines, and every train hunting mission carried the risk of return fire. The destroyers would approach under cover of darkness whenever possible, but even then the shore batteries would often open up, their muzzle flashes visible in the night. The Canadians learned to fire and maneuver, never staying in one position long enough to become an easy target. Quick bursts of fire, then hard rudder, then fire again. It was a deadly dance, played out night after night along the Korean coast. The physical toll on the ships was significant. The World War II-era destroyers had not been designed for this kind of prolonged, intensive service. Their engines, already worn from years of Atlantic operations, struggled to maintain the constant high-speed maneuvers required for train hunting. Their gun barrels, heated to extreme temperatures by continuous firing, wore down at an alarming rate. Maintenance crews worked around the clock, patching, welding, and improvising to keep the ships operational. The human toll was equally severe. Combat fatigue was rampant. Sailors who had signed up for what they expected to be peacetime service found themselves in a brutal war, constantly under threat of enemy fire, mines, and the ever-present danger of mechanical failure. Some cracked under the pressure, requiring evacuation to medical facilities in Japan. Others hardened, becoming steely-eyed veterans who could fire a gun mount in their sleep. The shared experience of combat forged bonds between the sailors that would last a lifetime. But the Canadian naval contribution to Korea went beyond the destroyers. 3,621 Canadian sailors served in Korean waters during the conflict, a remarkable number for a nation that had largely demobilized after the Second World War. These men represented every part of Canadian society. Fishermen from Nova Scotia who knew the sea in their bones, prairie boys from Saskatchewan who had never seen the ocean before joining the Navy, French Canadians from Quebec, English Canadians from Ontario, Indigenous sailors from the far north. They came together on the decks of the aging destroyers, united by a common purpose. The war also saw Canadian naval aviators in action, though in a different capacity. One Royal Canadian Navy pilot was attached to the United States Navy, flying combat missions from American aircraft carriers. This was a rare honor, a recognition of the close cooperation between the Canadian and American navies that had developed during the Second World War. The Canadian pilot flew dozens of missions over Korea, attacking enemy positions with bombs and rockets, contributing to the United Nations air campaign that sought to destroy communist infrastructure and support ground operations. On the ground, Canadian soldiers were also making their mark. The 2nd Battalion of Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry arrived in Korea in November 1950, transported by ship from Canada to the war zone. These soldiers, many of them veterans of the Second World War, would soon be tested in ways they could never have imagined. The defining moment came in April 1951 at the Battle of Kapyong. The Kapyong Valley was strategically vital, a corridor that led directly to the South Korean capital of Seoul. If the Chinese could break through, they would have a clear path to the heart of the country. American and South Korean forces had been defending the valley, but they were overwhelmed by a massive Chinese offensive and forced to retreat. The Canadians were ordered to hold the line. The 2nd Battalion of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry took up positions on Hill 677, a rugged height overlooking the valley floor. They numbered only a few hundred men, facing a Chinese force that numbered in the thousands. The odds were impossible. But the Canadians dug in, planted mines and booby traps along the likely avenues of approach, and waited. The attack came on the night of April 22nd. Wave after wave of Chinese soldiers surged up the hillside, their bugles blaring, their officers urging them forward. The Canadians opened fire, their rifles and machine guns cutting swaths through the advancing enemy. Mortars thumped, sending shells arcing into the night sky before crashing down among the Chinese formations. The fighting was close and brutal. At times the enemy reached the Canadian positions, and the soldiers fought hand to hand, using bayonets, rifle butts, and bare fists. The battle lasted 10 hours. Throughout the night, the Canadians held their ground, repelling attack after attack. By dawn, they were running low on ammunition and food. Aircraft were called in to drop supplies, the bundles landing among the exhausted soldiers who tore them open with desperate hands. The Chinese, having suffered terrible casualties, finally withdrew. Hill 677 remained in Canadian hands. The Battle of Kapyong was recognized as one of the most significant Canadian military achievements of the Korean War. The 2nd Battalion of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry received the United States Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest honors that can be bestowed on a foreign military unit. The soldiers had proven that Canadian ground forces could stand alongside the best in the world, but not every battle ended in victory. On May 30th, 1951, Canadian soldiers launched an assault on Hill 467, unaware that it was one of the most heavily fortified Chinese positions in the sector. The attack was a disaster. The Canadians advanced into a storm of fire, taking casualties at every step. Realizing the mission was impossible, the commanders ordered a withdrawal. The retreat was skillfully executed, with all 6 killed and 54 wounded soldiers recovered, but the sting of defeat lingered. The war ground on through 1951, 1952, and into 1953. The front lines shifted slightly, but neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough. For the Canadian destroyers, this meant continued patrols, continued bombardments, continued train hunting. The ships rotated in and out of the combat zone, with fresh vessels arriving from Canada as worn-out ones departed for repairs. HMCS Haida, perhaps the most famous Canadian destroyer of the Second World War, arrived in Korean waters in 1952. Haida had earned the nickname Fighting Guest Ship in the Royal Canadian Navy for her exploits against German destroyers and U-boats. Now she added a new chapter to her legend, conducting shore bombardments and coastal patrols with the same aggressive spirit that had characterized her wartime service. The ghost ship continued to fight. The war finally ended on July 27, 1953, with the signing of an armistice at Panmunjom. The fighting stopped, but the peace was uneasy. No formal treaty was ever signed, and technically, the Korean War continues to this day. For the Canadian Naval Forces, the end of hostilities did not mean an immediate departure. HMCS Sioux remained in Korean waters until September 1955, conducting patrols and showing the flag, a reminder that Canada remained committed to the defense of South Korea. The cost of the war had been significant. 516 Canadians lost their lives in Korea, including sailors, soldiers, and airmen. Many more were wounded, some carrying physical and psychological scars that would never fully heal. The destroyers themselves bore the marks of combat, their hulls patched with welds, their gun barrels worn smooth by thousands of rounds fired. But the legacy of Canada's Korean War naval contribution extends beyond the statistics. The decision to send those aging World War II destroyers to Korea in 1950 demonstrated something important about Canada's place in the world. A nation that had largely demobilized after the Second World War, that had focused on rebuilding its peacetime economy, still possessed the will and the capability to respond when the international community called for help. The ghost ships, relics of a previous conflict, proved that they still had fight left in them. The tribal-class destroyers that served in Korea would eventually be retired, replaced by more modern vessels designed for the Cold War era. Some were scrapped. Others were sold to foreign navies, but one, HMCS Haida, was preserved as a museum ship, a floating memorial to the sailors who served aboard her. Today, Haida is moored in Hamilton, Ontario, open to visitors who want to walk her decks and imagine what it was like to serve aboard her during the darkest days of the Second World War and the frozen waters of Korea. The sailors who crewed those destroyers are now old men, their numbers dwindling with each passing year. But they remember. They remember the terror of navigating mined waters. They remember the concussion of their own guns and the whistle of incoming shells. They remember the faces of the Korean civilians they helped evacuate, the gratitude in their eyes as they were pulled to safety. They remember their fallen comrades, the ones who did not come home. The Korean War is sometimes called the Forgotten War, overshadowed by the global conflict that preceded it and the Vietnam War that followed. But for the sailors of the Royal Canadian Navy and for the soldiers who fought alongside them, Korea was anything but forgotten. It was a crucible that tested their courage, their endurance, and their commitment to a cause larger than themselves. The ghost ships from the Second World War carried them into that crucible, and most of them came out the other side. The story of why Canada sent those aging destroyers to Korea in 1951 is ultimately a story about resilience. The resilience of ships that should have been retired, but instead found new purpose. The resilience of sailors who adapted to a war unlike any they had trained for. The resilience of a nation that rose to meet an unexpected challenge. When the call came, Canada answered, sending its ghost ships across the Pacific to fight in a war that would shape the Cold War world for decades to come. The Taedong River is quiet now. Chinampo, renamed Nampo, is a bustling North Korean port, its docks busy with cargo ships and fishing vessels. The mines have long since been cleared. The shore batteries are silent. But the ghosts remain. In the waters off the Korean coast, in the rusted hulls that lie on the ocean floor, in the memories of the sailors who survived, the story endures. Canada sent its ghost ships to Korea, and they did not disappoint. If this journey through history has resonated with you, remember to subscribe and share this video with others who appreciate the true stories of courage and sacrifice that shaped our world. The Chinampo evacuation remains one of the most daring naval operations of the Korean War, a testament to the skill and bravery of the Canadian sailors who risked everything to save lives. The train hunting missions along the Korean coast disrupted enemy supply lines and contributed to the eventual stalemate that ended the fighting. The presence of Canadian destroyers in Korean waters for 5 years demonstrated Canada's commitment to collective security and the defense of freedom. But perhaps the most important legacy is the human one. The 3,621 Canadian sailors who served in Korea returned home changed by their experiences. Some struggled with what they had seen and done. Others found strength in the knowledge that they had made a difference. All of them carried the memory of those ghost ships, the aging destroyers that had no business fighting another war but did so anyway because duty called. The ships are gone now, all but Haida consigned to history. But their spirit lives on in the Royal Canadian Navy of today, in the men and women who serve aboard modern frigates and submarines, carrying forward the traditions established by their predecessors. When those sailors pass by the memorial to the Korean War dead, or when they visit Haida in her Hamilton berth, they are reminded of what came before. They are reminded that ordinary people serving on ordinary ships can accomplish extraordinary things when the moment demands it. The 1950s were a time of uncertainty, when the Cold War threatened to become a hot war at any moment, when the lessons of the Second World War were still fresh, but the challenges of the future were murky. Canada navigated those uncertain waters as best it could, committing its limited military resources to the defense of a country half a world away. The ghost ships of 1951 were the physical manifestation of that commitment, aging warriors summoned back to duty for one more fight. And fight they did. Through mined rivers and frozen seas, under enemy fire and mechanical breakdowns, the Canadian destroyers persevered. They saved lives at Chinampo. They strangled enemy supply lines with their train hunting missions. They showed the flag and reminded the world that Canada, though small, was a nation willing to stand for its principles. The last Canadian ship departed Korean waters in September 1955, more than 2 years after the armistice was signed. The war was over, but the watch continued. It continues still in different forms, in different places, wherever freedom is threatened and courage is required. The ghost ships of Korea taught a generation of Canadian sailors what it meant to serve. That lesson has not been forgotten. As the sun sets over Hamilton Harbor, casting long shadows across the deck of HMCS Haida, visitors can almost hear the voices of the past, the shouted orders, the roar of the guns, the desperate prayers of men who knew that each moment might be their last. Haida endures, a steel monument to an era when Canada's Navy punched above its weight, when ghost ships sailed into danger, and when the courage of ordinary sailors changed the course of history. The reasons Canada sent those World War II destroyers to Korea in 1951 were complex. Strategic calculations played a role. The desire to support the United Nations and collective security was important. The need to demonstrate that Canada remained a reliable ally influenced the decision. But at its core, the decision was about people, the sailors who would crew those ships, the soldiers they would support, the civilians they would save. In the end, that human element made all the difference. The ghost ships of Korea earned their place in history not through advanced technology or overwhelming firepower, but through the determination of the men who sailed them. They faced impossible odds and prevailed. They navigated treacherous waters and survived. They upheld the honor of the Royal Canadian Navy and added new chapters to the legendary stories of ships like Haida and Cayuga. Today, when historians study the Korean War, They often focus on the great land battles, the dramatic amphibious landings, the aerial dogfights between jets. But the naval war was equally important, and Canada's contribution to that war was significant. The destroyers that patrolled the Korean coast, that bombarded enemy positions, that hunted trains along the railway lines, played a vital role in the eventual outcome. Without them, the war might have ended differently. The ghost ships of 1951 remind us that military equipment has a life beyond its intended expiration date. Ships designed for one war can be adapted for another. The skills learned in one conflict can be applied in the next. And the courage that sustained sailors through the horrors of the Second World War could sustain them again in the frozen waters off Korea. This is the story of Canada's ghost ships in Korea, a story of aging vessels pressed back into service, a story of young sailors learning the ways of war on decks that still bore the scars of previous battles, a story of courage, sacrifice, and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, a story that speaks to the best of what Canada can be when called upon to defend freedom. The ghost ships have sailed their last patrol, but their legacy endures, written in the histories of the Korean War, preserved in the museum ship that floats peacefully in Hamilton Harbor, and carried in the hearts of those who remember what those sailors accomplished so many years ago. When we speak of Korea, we should remember the destroyers. When we honor the veterans, we should include the sailors. When we tell the story of Canada at war, we should never forget the ghost ships that answered the call.